Good afternoon. Thank you very much. My name is Franciska Barabas-Komives, as it was mentioned, and my colleague Phil will also provide some information about this project later on. We are fully aware that we are the last presentation between you and the champagne reception, so we are aware of the time, and I try to give you an overview of what the EESSI project is, its legal basis, where it comes from, and where we stand currently with the development of this project. In fact, this is something that is currently still ongoing, a work in progress, so it didn't go live yet. And my colleague Phil will explain a little bit on how we're planning to use translation, machine translation within this framework. What is the background? What is EESSI? It stands for Electronic Exchange of Social Security Information, and it is an IT system that we are working on in DG Employment together with the member states to create a way for social security institutions across Europe, in all countries, to communicate between each other. Currently, this communication is paper-based mostly, meaning that if there's any file of a person, social security related, you can imagine anything from a pension file or a sickness file for someone who has been working in more than one country during their career or needed to go to the doctor when they were abroad. All these kinds of exchanges between national authorities right now are on paper-based, so it can be postal, and we will be implementing it electronically. And in order to do so, we are developing so-called structured electronic documents that are mentioned on this slide, and I'll come back to that a little bit later in terms of what this means for languages that we use. So these documents will be used, will be sent through the EESSI platform, through this IT service, and the correct destination can also be found by all the clerks because we already have a database of all these institutions registered that are planning to use EESSI in the future. The reason why we're doing this, of course, we would imagine that in the 21st century we are moving to an electronic world overall. However, we also have a very strong legal basis for it. In the Social Security Coordination Regulations, there is a legal basis to make sure that all the exchanges are happening electronically between institutions. And this is covering all social security branches that are covered by EU rules. I mentioned pension, sickness, family benefits, unemployment, you name it, everything will be covered by it. Also, this will cover all EU countries, as well as we have Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland as well, where these rules are applicable. So in terms of languages, that also adds a little bit more than the EU languages. Who will be using this? We have currently over 8,000 institutions who are registered, and we're updating this list as we're getting closer to presenting it or to starting the exchanges. This concerns all kinds of cross-border social security files of mobile citizens, and we have now an ongoing work to prepare the business processes and define how this will work. We have around 120, and the number of documents that are being defined is around 320. The numbers that you see are still estimative or approximate because this is work in progress. So just to give you a bit of an overview of the timeline on when we are planning to finalize these, this is an overview of where we started from and where we are today. By the end of 2013, around that time, there was a decision together with member states on what kind of technology to use and how to build this system. And then since 2014 and until mid-next year, there's a development ongoing in various pilot builds. We are hoping to have this finalized by mid-next year, after which the countries will have 2 years to connect the national institutions to the system. Just a little bit more detail on the steps here. We have done now a number of pilot builds that were tested with member states. Currently we are at the 3rd pilot build, which is the final pilot build. And after this, by the end of this year, we're hoping to have an integration-ready release, which means that countries will be able to start integration into their national domains. And by mid-next year, we're hoping to have the production-ready release. After this, there will be a 2-year period where all the social security institutions which are dealing with cross-border files will have to be connected to the system. And then when this is finalized, then we consider EESSI to be up and running in all countries. To look a little bit at the language requirements and the multilingualism that is important from your perspective, the way in which this works is that in our regulation there is a requirement that any document sent by a different institution in any EU language has to be accepted by the receiving institution. So the person, the clerk dealing with the file in their home country has no obligation to translate anything. They can send it in their own language and it has to be accepted by the receiving side. This is why we create standardized forms to make sure that people are familiar with what the form looks like and know what field means what. And these structured electronic documents have already been agreed and translated by DigiTranslation. Currently, we are working with 24 languages. In fact, this is EU languages without Irish, but we also have Norwegian, and the Norwegian translation is done by the Norwegian authorities. The rest of it is done by DGT. The IT solution itself, so the next step will be the question on how these forms are being filled in. And this is the part where we are looking into using the e-translation services, and my colleague will explain in detail what is planned on that. This is just an example to give you a visual on what the forms look like today. So this is a typical claim for reimbursement in case of a person who, for example, fell ill during a stay abroad and needed medical treatment, when the authorities then had to contact each other for reimbursement. This is a claim for reimbursement in an English version and in a German version. It's just the first page of it. So it's a standardized form that everyone knows which field means what. And this exists currently, as I said, in 24 languages. Now, on what we're planning for the future and to further facilitate the work of the clerks, this is where I give the word to my colleague Phil Cummings to explain a little bit how the CEFI translation is planned to be used in ESSI.
Okay, hello everyone. My name's Phil Cummings. I'm from the Technologies unit in DG EMPL, and I just wanted to run through some slides to show you how we propose to use the e-translation services in ESSI. So just to begin, just a very short slide to show you the architecture that we use in ESSI. It's quite different, I think, to a lot of architectures which are used in the Commission, because we're actually a distributed system. That means there's no central repository in the European Commission where the data is exchanged. It's all done member state to member state. The key things on the diagram to show is the central service node in the middle. This is a sort of a registry of all of the institutions in the EU that will exchange the social security information. You can see the two-ended arrow, I think we'll call it. This is an access point. This is like a gateway into the international domain. Every member state must have at least one access point to be able to communicate with the other member states. And then around Europe, we have many national applications which are represented by the CI box, meaning competent institution in the member states. So basically, what we plan to do in ESSI is to exchange SEDs from one competent institution through the access points to an institution in another member state. And normally, we'll exchange lots of SEDs all around Europe like this. So there's actually three main software developments ongoing in the project. Firstly, there's the central services node, which I mentioned is the directory. Secondly, we have to develop the access point, which is provided by the Commission to member states. And thirdly, we also plan to provide to them an application which we call RINA, and that stands for Reference Implementation of a National Application. Again, it's a software developed by us, which we provide to member states free of charge, and allows them to connect to their access point, create messages, send messages, and do all of the day-to-day work in an electronic environment. Now, why do I mention this? I mention this because it's important to understand where we plan to use the e-translation services, which we're all here to obviously discuss today. And from our project perspective, we will use them exclusively in the national application in RINA, and I'll refer to it as RINA from now on. Okay, so the scope touched on by Franciska. We want to provide on-demand translation in the RINA solution. This is our current orientation. We want to provide in 24 languages, if possible, through the translation services. We have, as Franciska mentioned, over 320 SEDs, which you can consider forms. We want to provide the translations for specific data types within the messages. So we have 2 or 3 data types, business data types that we defined, which have over 255 characters in length. These are the strings that we will try and target for the translation service. Again, the scope, we believe that RINA can be used by over 8,000 institutions across Europe. And we think it can be used by over 200,000 clerks in those institutions. And we also estimate over 900 million messages to be exchanged per year in the domain. So it's a very big business, and that will, of course, mean lots of translations, as you'll probably see. Okay, just to introduce a little bit where we are currently. So we develop iteratively in the project. We work quite agile. We're now reaching the point where we're getting around to consider some of the nice to have features of the application, of which the use of e-translation services we consider to be one. So we start usually by looking at the wireframes, looking at the use cases which are needed in the application. So here's a very simple wireframe of how we want it to look. I don't know how easy it is to read the text, but there's some explanatory text around what we expect. But in the forms, we want to see a button which says translate, which the user can then click on to provide a translation of the text into another language. So what typically will happen is a clerk, for example, in Romania, will write to a clerk in the UK, and they might need to put some free text into the SED. They'll write in Romanian, as is their right to do so, and the English clerk for sure will not know what's written in Romanian. So we hope this service will provide a very quick and simple way to get a good understanding of what it is the clerk in Romania expects the clerk in the UK to provide to them. So you see, quite simply, click the button and you'll get the translation provided there in the web form. How it actually looks in the application, this is a mock-up, it's not developed yet, but most of the application is. So we take the clerk in the sending side, as I say, who will fill in the text in his national language. I'll speed through this. So he writes in his national language. He'll then fill out the rest of the SED and he'll send this to the other member state. When they receive it in the application, they get a notification to inform them that a new document has arrived. They'll then be able to click on the link to open up the SED, and they'll of course see the text in the Romanian language, or Hungarian. I think this is Hungarian. You see the translate button in the web form. The clerk will click the translate button. And then we'll make a call to the e-translation service, get back the translated information and provide it to the end user, who will then be able to progress the case as they need to do. As I mentioned, we work iteratively, so we are still in the design phase of this. So we're working on the specifications and the design currently. We begin to start the initial testing with the service in around December time. And we plan to release an updated version of the web forms, which will allow us to use the web service in March 2017, so March next year. So the last slide is just to mention what we can offer to the e-translation service. We have quite rich vocabularies of social security phrases and words, which we'll provide. We have the 320 SEDs containing 35,000 labels and quite lengthy explanatory notes in the 24 languages mentioned. We go through the translation process firstly with DGT, who provide us with an initial translation. Then we go through quite a lengthy review process with the member states, so with domain experts in social security who provide us with really close and accurate translations for the actual domain. We also translate RINA, so RINA is also available in all languages, and we have the possibility to provide these vocabularies also to the e-translation service. And again, these translations are currently done through DGT as well. So that's sort of a quick run through of ESSI, what it is, what we plan to do. If you have any questions, we're welcome to take them now.
Can you tell me what we need to do to get Irish in there now?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think this was something that was discussed with the Irish authorities, or for the social security purposes, they didn't require Irish as a language in there. So I think it is for them to decide. Of course, it's an official EU language, but as far as we have been informed by the authorities, they're happy to work in English.
It's actually a question for all the speakers and also for Josef and for Khalid, so to everyone. You know, as more and more people actually use machine translation in their processes, and you're making data available to the community, you get this kind of circular issue that the data that's contributed is already the output of machine translation. Google had that problem with Google Translate, that they were training increasingly on Google translated text or translations. And so they had to build extra detection algorithms that would figure out whether this was a Google translation or a real translation. Now, when you're doing this here in this community with lots of different translation versions, that problem may be worse. And it could be potentially prevented by tagging the data appropriately so that it's flagged as, you know, inside the data you flag whether it was machine generated or human generated. Because it's clearly the human generated data that's the useful one.
Yeah, well, you have seen, and this emphasized the importance of the language research that we were looking for from the various partners and contributors. We're trying to work with data centers, with translation services, to make sure that we are getting data translated by professionals. We check some of the alignment and some of the, when we get, for instance, Word files or PDF files and we convert them, we try to check how this is done. But basically, the input is coming from translation professionals. And when we are getting to crawling the web or harvesting data from other sources, we are doing similar approaches, but not here, in other contexts, to identify that the translations we are getting are really human translations, or at least post-edited things. So we are working on algorithm. We are working also with human validating the data, checking that, for instance, a website that offers 15 languages is a very good sign to check carefully if it's done by humans or by machines and this kind of thing. So, but again, I think the importance of the whole program that we are describing today is to get data from professionals to make sure that we train our machines with that kind of data before we go to the next generation.
The professions could be using MT.
Well, that's what I insist very much, that in the collaboration with professionals, we try to make sure that we get metadata elements, and hopefully part of this metadata is description of the tools they use to produce it. And yeah, we try to get translation memories, for instance, and those who are using MT or something like that, we should document that.
Yeah, you see these two gentlemen are testing your patience to see, you know, how much until there's a riot or something like that. Yeah, but so let me test your patience a little bit more and and just respond to Alex briefly. It's one of the areas actually where machines have superhuman capabilities. So algorithms, machine learning-based algorithms, are able to discriminate between whether a text is, for example, a professional human translation, or whether the same, or not the same text, a similar text in the same genre, for example, has been originally authored in that language. And for entire document, the success rates are 90%, 95%, 100%. Whereas if you give the same task to the best of our translators or best professionals, they're just above chance, just above 50%. And so machine translation at the moment is a bit more crude than our best human translators. And I think there's some hope that I think to a certain degree of accuracy we can filter these texts. But you're absolutely right. I think the problem is much, much more aggravated and varied. Then, yeah, it will get worse, yeah, without any doubt. Yeah.